There are only a handful of places in the entire world that can claim that they have invented an entire genre, and one of them happens to be New Orleans. For those who are new to the channel, I am an avid record collector, coffee lover, and so when I got invited to a work trip to New Orleans, I was ecstatic because I knew I had to check out their iconic jazz clubs, check out their unique coffee scene, as well as take home some records for myself. While the majority of the time was spent in meetings, I did manage to visit arguably the most legendary jazz club in the entire world. I tried coffee that you likely won't find anywhere else in the US. And of course, I didn't come home without taking some records that I believe truly define the New Orleans sound. Now, coming to New Orleans, I had to kind of reconfigure my perception of what jazz sounds like. Nowadays, jazz is perceived as this sophisticated genre, something you might listen to in the background of a coffee shop. But at the very beginning of the invention of the entire genre, jazz back in the day was a bit more upbeat and rowdy versus more sophisticated and laid back as it's mostly perceived today. And rather than acting as soothing background music, jazz at the time was in front, in the center, and was the main event in the venue that it was played in. Now, if I can only visit one jazz club in all of New Orleans, it would be the Preservation Hall. This jazz club is definitely the most authentic. It was opened in the 60s, and to my knowledge, it hasn't really been touched since. And so once you go in the building, the space is rather cramped. It's a bit humid. There's no AC. So while there, I kind of felt like I time traveled back to the 60s. I got one of the standing tickets at the back. The tickets are a little bit more expensive compared to what you can get around, but I definitely think it's worth it. You get that authentic New Orleans jazz sound as it was played back in the day. They don't allow any filming during the recording, and so it's very exclusive, so you really have to go there to experience it for yourself. I loved how rugged and raw the performance sounded like. Everyone was so lively, the audience was into it, and so it was a very engaging performance. And so they're not really known for hosting a lot of notable jazz musicians over the years. However, they do pride themselves in preserving that authentic sound. And so if that's something that you're chasing, definitely check out the Preservation Hall. Around the corner from the Preservation Hall is the iconic Bourbon Street. And on that street, there are only a couple of jazz clubs, but the one that I popped my head into was Maison Bourbon. This jazz club is one of the oldest in all of New Orleans. And if you're looking for a jazz club that preserves the authentic jazz sound of New Orleans back in the day, this is definitely one of them you need to check out. As I was walking down the street, I popped my head in. It looked like a very typical open bar. Entrance is essentially free, but they do encourage you to get a drink while you're there. By the time I showed up, I only had some space to stand at the back, but I really enjoyed the music. It was very loud and lively. Again, here, everyone was really into it. And so what I've learned after visiting my second jazz club at this point is that it's all about engaging with the crowd and just having fun with it. And so rather than everyone being dressed up in suits, everyone was kind of in their own attire, dressed nicely, but you could tell that their personality was shining on that stage. So if you're looking again for that authentic New Orleans jazz sound, Maison Bourbon is definitely a recommendation. This jazz club is located on a rather unassuming street in the French Quarter. And so if you want to escape those long queues or big crowds, definitely check out this one. It can fill up during busy seasons like Mardi Gras. Definitely make sure you try to get there early, but even if it does get full, you can still pop your head in and check out the music from the entrance. Similar to Maison Bourbon, Mahogany Jazz Club is essentially free, but they encourage you to get a drink while you're there, and drink prices are rather fair. They do specialize in local cocktails as well as absinthe-based drinks, and so if that's what you're into, definitely go for that. I don't drink alcohol myself, but they did have a rather small non-alcoholic menu. And what I love about this jazz bar is that the stage was front and center. You can't go through the bar without walking past the stage. And so I was lucky enough to be sitting right in front of the stage and witness the performance right up close. The band that was performing, one of them I believe was related to a very iconic jazz musician who I can't recall the name of, But the entire band was rather old, which I kind of like because you kind of get that feeling that they're doing it because they love it and they've been doing it for years. And so again, here, everyone was having fun with it. They did have a guest musician from Spain, I believe. And so it was quite a nice, authentic experience. What I loved about this performance was at the very end, we all sang You Are My Sunshine. So it was a little bit of call and response led by the band. And I only discovered then that it was a song that actually came from New Orleans. And so I loved how the crowd was truly into it. It's such a universal song, and to see it performed live and to see it performed from all kinds of visitors in this jazz bar, it was truly a memorable experience. So if you're located in the heart of the French Quarter, definitely pop by this jazz hall. It's definitely one that I would recommend to anyone. Now, quick tip if you are into music in general and maybe the bar scene or jazz scene is not really your thing, what you can always count on is fantastic street music. Now, I was lucky enough to be visiting during the tail end of Mardi Gras, and so there are all kinds of musicians day and night performing, and you get a mix of genres. You get that big brass jazz band ensembles in the streets, you get soul artists, you get blues artists, and so I remember walking down the street late at night and I just heard some nice soulful bluesy sound, and it was just kind of a vibe walking down the streets. And so even if you don't pop into any jazz clubs or bars, you definitely get a sense of why New Orleans is one of the most iconic music cities in the entire world. So whether you're walking around in the day or night, definitely take some time to enjoy the music scene that New Orleans has to offer. Now, as someone who has grown an affinity towards the third wave specialty coffee scene, I would say New Orleans is not really known for that specifically, but they do have a very unique history when it comes to coffee. What I learned about New Orleans and Louisiana in general is that they were one of the most important ports for importing coffee from Latin America. What I learned was that during the Civil War times, the Union Navy essentially tried to block imports from coming through New Orleans. And so one of the largest imports at the time was coffee. And as you might know, New Orleans and Louisiana were colonized by the French. And so what they adopted was this taste for chicory, which is essentially a root. When you grind it up and add hot water to it, it does resemble the taste of coffee. And so when the blockade happened, they resorted to chicory coffee to kind of get them through the day. It doesn't contain any caffeine, but it kind of gives that placebo effect that you are drinking coffee. And so over time, after the war and everything, people just decided to drink chicory anyways and combine it with their caffeine to kind of dilute the amount of caffeine in their drink. Even today, you can still find chicory coffee all over the city. And so that's what I did at the first stop, which was Pirate King Coffee. It doesn't really look like a coffee shop at first glance, but they do label themselves as a coffee shop. It's located on this cute side street in the French Quarter. They essentially pay homage to this infamous pirate named Jean Lafitte, who was known for doing some controversial things back in the early days of New Orleans. So in this shop, you'll mostly find pirate memorabilia. So I popped in during one of my lunch breaks and I asked them about chicory coffee because I didn't know about it back then. And the barista at the time explained what it was, and so I gave it a try. And to be honest, I noticed no difference. It really tastes like coffee. And so if you're looking for an alternative to reduce your caffeine consumption, I can definitely recommend chicory coffee. But when it comes to third wave or specialty coffee, there is a very well-known chain called French Truck Coffee. And you'll find them all over the city. There's a few located in the French Quarter. And so this is my go-to during the mornings right before my workday. They've even expanded beyond New Orleans, so you might find it in other states as well. They are known for providing more lighter roasts compared to their peers in the city as well. So if you're more into filter coffee, I would definitely recommend checking out French Truck Coffee. I actually picked up these beans on my trip. This is the Preservation Hall blend. What I find that's very unique about this blend is typically collaborations are for espresso beans, but this one actually happened to be a filter coffee. It has notes of smooth chocolate, sweet citrus, and red apple. And so I finished it at this point, but it was such a nice daily coffee for me. It's something that is rather accessible, so not overly fruity, not overly acidic, but a very pleasant taste nonetheless. And so I picked this up at the Preservation Hall Jazz Club, but you can also pick it up in store if it's still available. During my first visit, one of the first things I tried was a iced pour over, and I had to be honest, I wasn't used to the amount of ice that they were adding, and so The lady initially filled up the whole cup with ice, and I told her to kind of cut it in half. And so that was something I was missing. It was in February, and so I needed something a bit more chilling to cool me down during the warm weather. They use this modern pour machine, which I've never seen in person. And so they're definitely innovative when it comes to their coffee preparation methods, especially in New Orleans. And so again, if you're into third wave specialty coffee, definitely check out this spot. Another coffee shop I visited before my workday was Bon Ami, which is located in a building that used to host cotton merchants back in the day. Little fun fact about this place is that the iconic painter Edgar Degas painted his painting A Cotton Office in New Orleans in this very building. And so if you're familiar with the painting, you might see some resemblance in the coffee shop. What's nice is that they do maintain its rugged walls. It still kind of feels raw and historic when you walk in, but it's quite spacious. It's quite modern as well. And so the counter kind of acts as the centerpiece, and then there's some seating along the walls as well as along the counter. So I took the opportunity to do some work. They've got some free Wi-Fi, and there's plenty of space if you are looking for a nice co-working spot. There I picked up a batch brew, something nice and easy to drink as I was preparing for some meetings, but definitely check it out if you are looking for some place to work, as well as a place that has some history to it. The final coffee shop during my visit was Fourth Wall. Now this place is very cozy, it's charming. It also has somewhat of a rugged aesthetic to it, which is nice and complementary to the modern setup at the front. The front kind of gave me some cottage vibes, if that makes any sense. The building itself is over 175 years old from what I've read, and they're also known for hosting a wide array of events. They have a nice patio in the back as well as enough seating to host a large party. They are a multi-roasters, so on their shelf they had some local roasters from all over New Orleans, and here as well I took a batch brew as I was again preparing for some meetings and hopping on some calls. This is a great place to get some work done or read a book if that is your cup of tea. Now, preparing for this trip, I had planned to visit a few record shops, but I was very limited on time. It's really hard to find something that's open past typical working hours, but I did land on Euclid Records. I ended up taking the bus, which is very cheap, just outside of the center of the city. And it was quite eye-opening. The neighborhood of the record store was different to what I was experiencing in the French Quarter, to say the least, but had its own charm. Euclid Records is actually the second location. The first one opened up in St. Louis in the 80s, I believe. But as I entered, I knew that I was in the right spot. They have such a wide selection of records. I learned only afterwards that they have 2 floors, but I only got to really explore one half of the ground floor. I came with a list of records that I was looking for. So I went straight to the guy that was working there at the time, and he pointed me to the New Orleans section and the jazz section. And so if you're looking for some New Orleans-based musicians, specifically jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong or Fats Domino, there are plenty of records for you. A lot of reissues as well. Very few, if any, original or early pressings of these records. I took the opportunity to sample some records on their turntable setup, which is really nice. Could have spent hours there, to be honest. It was such a lovely experience. So if you're curious about the records that I took home, definitely check out the next video. I'm super stoked to talk about these records because I believe that they encapsulate different facets of New Orleans music. But yeah, if you're looking for a good mix of genres, some memorabilia, and a place that really highlights New Orleans musicians, definitely check out Euclid Records. Now, during one of my lunch breaks, I made my way to this bookstore because I had initially thought that they had records. But as of recently, the owner of the records moved to a different location. And so if you check out this bookshop, it will only be books. So a few minutes away was Beckham's Bookshop. Now, I was quite overwhelmed in a very positive way of the selection of books. Now, I'm not a huge reader myself, but when I do read, I prefer nonfiction, something that offers some complementary information to my personal interests. And so what I ended up taking home was The History of Jazz by Ted Gia. So Ted Gia is essentially a musician, an author, a jazz historian, and so I'm only about a quarter of the way done, but I learned so much about the history of jazz. It's rough origins and how culture plays a huge role in shaping the sound, but also the adoption of the genre itself. So if you are into jazz and you want to dive into the history of it, this is definitely my #1 recommendation. Now, before I wrap up this video, I want to give you a bonus tip. Now, if you are planning your trip to New Orleans, odds are you've stumbled upon Cafe du Monde, which is known for their iconic beignets. It's like the fried dough covered in powdered sugar. This is in fact my second time visiting New Orleans, and so I had done that the first time. It didn't really pique my interest to do it the second time. However, if you are flying in or out of New Orleans, they do have a location there as well. And the line is a lot shorter. You get the same beignets. They have chicory coffee there as well. So if you want to sample the beignets, but don't want to wait the long line, definitely check it out at the airport. You won't get the same atmosphere, of course, as the original location, but you do get to sample the iconic beignets as you head to your next flight. And in case you're wondering where I stayed at the Hotel Monteleone. This was planned by the organizers of the trip, so it wasn't my decision, but it was a fantastic decision. This is one of the most iconic hotels in all of New Orleans. They're most known for their carousel bar, which is essentially a bar that rotates every few minutes rather slowly. I didn't get a chance to sit down and experience it, but the hotel as a whole was very charming, very beautiful. It kind of kept its, mid-century kind of decor, which I really liked. And the guys at the door are extremely friendly, so definitely check it out if you are staying in New Orleans. So that about wraps up my recap of my short but very sweet trip to New Orleans. I hope you learned a thing or two about the city itself. I definitely want to go back at some point in my life, and as someone who has grown an affinity for jazz, it was just a must visit. It was high on my bucket list. And if you did take something away, I would encourage you to like and subscribe. And if there's anything you particularly like, let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to reply. And as I mentioned, if you want to see my New Orleans record haul, definitely subscribe and stay tuned for the video. I'm also on TikTok and Instagram if you prefer more bite-sized content. And with that, I want to encourage you to slow down, take a sip, and drop the needle. See you in the next one. Peace.
Holy sunshine, you make me happy when skies are gray. You never know, dear.